There is a word forming somewhere behind your eyes right now, and you did not decide to make it. Maybe it is a fragment of something you read earlier today, a stray syllable, half a sentence that arrived uninvited and is already dissolving before you can catch its edges. Notice it if you can, gently, the way you might notice a shadow crossing a wall. Do not chase it. It will not hold still long enough to be caught, and that is completely fine, because tonight is not about catching anything. Tonight is about lying quietly while something in you keeps forming little scraps of language, over and over, softly, the way waves keep arriving on a shore, whether or not anyone is watching them. Let your body settle a little more into whatever is holding it, the mattress, the chair, the floor. Feel the small give of it beneath your shoulders. And while that happens, let your attention rest on something strange that you have probably never stopped to examine, something so constant that it has become almost invisible, the way the sound of your own breathing disappears until someone mentions it. That strange thing is the voice, the one that seems to speak inside your head, the one that is, in some sense, speaking right now, quietly narrating this sentence back to you as you take it in, syllable by syllable, in a rhythm that sounds uncannily like a real human voice, even though no one nearby can hear it, and even though, if we are honest, it is not entirely clear what is making the sound at all. Here is the puzzle, laid out plainly, the way you might lay out a set of old photographs on a table to look at them properly for the first time. When someone speaks aloud, air moves. Their vocal cords vibrate, columns of pressure ripple outward through the room, and those ripples eventually reach a part of your ear, called the eardrum, a thin membrane about the size of a small coin, which trembles in response and sets off a chain of mechanical and then electrical events that your brain interprets, eventually, as sound. That is the ordinary story of hearing, and it is a beautifully physical one. Molecules bump into other molecules. Something vibrates. Something else detects the vibration. It is, in its way, no more mysterious than a struck bell. But when you read these words, or when a thought simply arrives in that inner voice of yours, none of that happens. No air moves. Your eardrum sits perfectly still, and yet something in you is undeniably producing an experience that has many of the same qualities as hearing. It has a kind of tone. It has a pace. It can sound patient or hurried, warm or clipped, and for many people it can even sound like a particular person, carrying the cadence of a parent, a favorite teacher, a friend who has a habit of finishing sentences a certain way. How can an experience be so vivid, so specific, so much like listening, when there is nothing actually arriving at the part of your body that is built for listening? This is worth sitting with for a moment, not to solve it, but simply to feel the shape of the mystery, because feeling the shape of a mystery is a very different thing from being troubled by it. You can hold a puzzle loosely, the way you might hold a smooth stone in your palm, without needing to do anything with it. So let the question sit there. If sound requires vibration, and vibration requires physical contact between things, then what exactly is happening when language seems to sound out inside a skull with no vibration involved at all? One clue comes from something almost embarrassingly ordinary, and it has to do with what your throat is doing right at this moment. It is very likely doing almost nothing that you can consciously detect. But researchers going back nearly a century, including a physiologist named Edmund Jacobson working in the 1920s, found something curious when they attached extremely sensitive instruments to people's throats and asked them to think in words rather than speak them. The muscles of the vocal apparatus, The very small muscles around the larynx and the tongue showed tiny flickers of electrical activity, faint traces of the same kind of activation that happens during actual speech, just turned down to a whisper of a whisper. The body, it seemed, was rehearsing the motion of talking, even when no talking was meant to happen, not moving enough to make a sound, not moving enough for anyone else to notice, or even for the person themselves to feel it happening, but moving nonetheless, in miniature, like a pianist's fingers, twitching slightly during a dream about playing. This does not mean your throat is secretly whispering your thoughts to you, and that is the whole answer, because the picture turns out to be far more layered than that, and later we will spend real time with the parts of the brain that seem to generate this inner voice even in people whose vocal cords have been surgically removed entirely, people who have lost the capacity to physically speak in any way, and who nonetheless report still hearing themselves think in words. So the throat is not the whole story, but it is a wonderful first thread to notice, because it tells you something important right at the start of all this. Whatever this inner voice is, it is not purely abstract. It is not floating free of the body like some detached ghost of language. It seems to be built, at least in part, out of the same neural machinery that produces actual speech, just running that machinery in a different mode, a kind of rehearsal mode, an internal dress rehearsal for a performance that never quite goes on stage. Think for a moment about how a memory of a song can play in your mind with real melodic detail, complete with rhythm and phrasing, even though your ears are receiving nothing but the low hum of a quiet room. Somewhere in your brain, the machinery that once processed the actual sound of that song is being lightly reactivated, replaying its own trace of the experience. Something similar seems to happen with speech and inner language, except that inner speech is even stranger, because so much of it was never heard from the outside in the first place. Many of your inner sentences are ones you have never spoken aloud even once. They are new. They are freshly assembled combinations of words that your mind produces on the spot, and yet they still arrive dressed in the recognizable clothing of a voice, with intonation, with pauses, with something that functions almost like breath, even though no breath is involved. There is something quietly moving about this when you actually stop to consider it, rather than rushing past it the way we usually do. Your brain has built for you a companion made of nothing but pattern and prediction, something that can produce, at will, the convincing illusion of another presence speaking to you, using resources borrowed from the very same systems that let you talk to other people out loud. It does this constantly, all day, and it is very likely doing some quiet version of it right now, even as your body sinks further into stillness, even as your breathing begins to slow and lengthen the way it naturally does when sleep is somewhere nearby, waiting. You do not need to figure any of this out tonight. You do not need to hold on to the details, the names, the small facts about flickering throat muscles or replayed melodies. Let those things settle the way sediment settles in a glass of water left undisturbed on a table overnight, drifting quietly downward while the water above grows clear. All that matters for now is the noticing itself, the simple observation that something in you produces language that feels heard without ever needing sound.
and that this has been true every single day of your life, without you ever really pausing to ask how strange it is.
In the next part, we will follow that thread further back, into the very first place this inner voice seems to come from in a human life, long before it takes on the polished, fluent shape you know today. We will look at children and at the softly spoken sentences they say out loud to themselves while playing alone with blocks or toy animals, murmuring instructions to themselves the way a small conductor murmurs to an orchestra only they can hear, and how that outward murmuring over years slowly folds inward and becomes the quiet voice you are listening to right now. The voice does not always arrive the same way twice, and this is worth sitting with for a moment, quietly, the way you might sit with any small mystery that has been hiding in plain sight your whole life. Sometimes it comes as something close to full sentences, tidy and complete, almost as if a sentence has been typed out somewhere just behind your forehead. You might think, in words that feel whole and grammatical, I need to remember to email her back tomorrow, each word present, each word in its proper place, almost as though you were reading a line from a page that exists nowhere but inside you. This is the form of inner speech most people notice first, because it resembles ordinary talking so closely, just with the sound turned all the way down. But if you listen more carefully, over many nights and many quiet moments, you may notice that this fully formed version is not actually the most common one. Far more often, what passes through the mind is something smaller, faster, more compressed, something that carries meaning the way a single glance between old friends can carry an entire shared memory without either person saying a word. A psychologist studying the mind nearly a century ago, a man named Lev Vygotsky, working in Moscow in the early decades of the 20th century, described this compressed form of thought as something closer to shorthand than to sentences, something abbreviated almost past the point of recognizable grammar. He suggested that when we think privately, the words we use for others fall away, and what remains is closer to a kind of telegraph, single words or fragments standing in for entire ideas the way a single word scrawled on a note, like milk, or later, can stand in for a whole intention you already understand completely. You do not need the full sentence, remember, to buy milk on the way home, because some part of you has already compressed that entire thought down into something closer to a flicker, a nudge, a feeling shaped like a word, and only sometimes does that flicker unfold itself into something you could write down and hand to another person. Then there are the conversations, the ones that never happened anywhere except inside you, and yet feel, in the moment, remarkably real. You might find yourself rehearsing what to say to someone before a difficult meeting, running the exchange forward like a small play performed for an audience of one, giving voice to both sides, your own words and the words you imagine the other person saying back, complete with their particular tone, their particular way of pausing before disagreeing with you. Or perhaps it happens after the fact, instead of before, late at night, long after an argument has ended, when you find yourself replaying it with new lines added, better ones, the retort you wish you had thought of in the moment finally arriving now, hours too late to matter to anyone but you. This, too, is inner speech, but it is inner speech wearing the costume of dialogue, borrowing two voices from the same source, the same underlying machinery that only ever really has one mouth to work with.
Reading does something curious to this same voice, something so ordinary that it is easy to forget it happens at all. If you have ever caught yourself hearing the words on a page as you read them silently, as though someone, possibly even you, were speaking the sentences aloud somewhere, just behind your eyes, you have noticed something that once struck people as genuinely remarkable. There is a passage from the writings of Augustine, the North African bishop and philosopher who lived in the 4th century, in which he describes watching his teacher Ambrose read. Augustine writes, with something like fascination, that when Ambrose read, his eyes moved across the page and his mind absorbed the meaning, but his voice remained silent, his tongue still. Augustine found this worth remarking on, precisely because, at the time, silent reading was unusual enough to be noteworthy. Most reading, in the ancient world, was done aloud, even when a person was reading only to themselves, lips moving, voice sounding quietly into an empty room. Somewhere across the centuries that followed, that outward voice folded inward for most people, the way a hand might slowly close around something it has been holding out in the open air, until the words could be heard, in some sense, without ever needing to be spoken. The voice also loves to repeat itself, sometimes in ways that are useful, and sometimes in ways that feel like a small, harmless nuisance. A song fragment might lodge itself and circle for hours, the same 4 or 5 notes turning over and over, a phenomenon so common that researchers have simply taken to calling these earworms, as though the melody had burrowed in somewhere and made itself a small, temporary home.
A phrase someone said to you earlier in the day, an offhand comment, might return again and again in their exact remembered tone, replaying itself without asking your permission, the same way a stone skips several times across water before finally settling beneath the surface. Some people find they can use this same tendency toward repetition deliberately, repeating a single phrase to themselves like a quiet anchor, a way of returning attention to one place when the mind has wandered somewhere less comfortable. This, too, is the same voice, simply put to a different kind of work. What is perhaps most surprising, if you have always assumed that everyone's inner life looks roughly like your own, is how much this varies from person to person. A researcher named Russell Hurlburt spent decades developing a method for studying this directly, rather than simply asking people to guess or generalize about their own minds after the fact, which turns out to be a surprisingly unreliable way of finding out anything true. His method was simple in design, if demanding in practice. People would carry a small device that beeped at random, unpredictable moments throughout the day, and the instant it beeped, they were asked to notice, as precisely as possible, exactly what had been present in their experience the moment before the sound interrupted them. Not what they usually think, not what they imagined they might have been thinking, but what was actually there, in that specific instant. What Hurlburt and his collaborators found, across many years and many participants, was far more varied than expected. Even among people who did experience inner speech regularly, it turned out to occupy a smaller fraction of their mental life than they would have guessed, often accompanied by, or replaced by, images, physical sensations, or something closer to a wordless sense of a feeling, present without any language attached to it at all. And then there are people, a meaningful minority, who report something else entirely, something that can be startling to hear about, if you have never questioned your own experience closely enough to wonder whether it might not be universal. Some people describe having little or no experience of a verbal inner monologue at all, no sentence stream running quietly behind their thoughts, no small companion narrating their day back to them in words. Researchers have taken to calling this an endophasia, a somewhat clinical word for a very ordinary variation in how human minds happen to be built. This does not mean these people are somehow thinking less, or thinking incompletely.
Their thoughts may move instead through images, through spatial arrangements, through a kind of wordless certainty that simply arrives already understood, without ever needing to be dressed in language first. It is a reminder, gentle and easy to overlook, that the voice you have been listening to all your life, the one narrating this very sentence back to you right now, in your own particular cadence, is not some fixed feature, installed identically in every human head, but one version among several quietly different ways a mind can go about the business of thinking to itself. And if a voice like that can vary so much between one person and the next, fully formed in one mind, and almost entirely absent in another, it becomes worth asking where it comes from in the first place, back before it settled into whatever shape it now takes in you, back in the years when it was still learning how to speak at all.
To answer that question, people have gone looking in some unlikely places, and some very old ones, long before anyone had a laboratory, or a questionnaire, or a beeper going off at random moments to ask what was passing through someone's mind. Humans were already puzzling over the sensation of hearing something inside themselves that seemed almost, but not quite, like another person talking. In the plays and philosophical writings of ancient Greece, you find characters and thinkers describing an inner voice as something closer to a visitor than a possession, a guiding presence, a warning, a nudge from outside the self, rather than a product manufactured by it. Socrates, at least as Plato remembers him, spoke of what he called his daimonion, a kind of inner sign that came to him unbidden, always telling him what not to do, never instructing him toward some new action, only holding him back at certain moments, like a hand quietly closing over his wrist before he crossed some threshold he should not cross. He described it not as his own reasoning, dressed up in a different voice, but as something separate, something that arrived from elsewhere, faithful and inexplicable, a companion he had learned to trust, precisely because it had never once misled him. It is tempting, listening from this distance in time, to hear that description and immediately translate it into modern terms, to say that Socrates was simply describing his conscience, or his intuition, or an early and articulate account of ordinary inner speech. But it is worth resisting that translation, at least for a moment, and sitting instead with how differently people across history have made sense of this same basic experience, the felt sense of an inner voice that seems to know something before you consciously do. For a very long stretch of human history, across many cultures, this kind of inner prompting was not understood as something the self generated at all. It was understood as communication, a message arriving from gods, spirits, ancestors, or some other order of being altogether. The boundary between one's own thoughts and an outside voice speaking into the mind was, for many people across many centuries, simply not drawn in the place we draw it now. What we might call inner speech today, they might have called prophecy, or possession, or the quiet visitation of something sacred. This is not to say that ancient people were confused, or that they lacked the capacity to distinguish their own thoughts from an external voice. It is closer to say that the concepts available to them for describing inner experience were built differently, shaped by different assumptions about where a self begins and ends, and where the mind sits in relation to the wider world of gods and spirits it was assumed to share space with. Layered over centuries, in religious traditions across the world, the inner voice took on another meaning still, becoming closely bound up with conscience, with the sense of a moral witness lodged somewhere inside a person, watching, judging gently or harshly,
urging them back toward some better version of their own conduct. In this framing, the voice was less a narrator of ordinary thought and more a kind of resident authority, present specifically at moments of temptation or wrongdoing, quiet the rest of the time, the way a lighthouse only matters once the fog has rolled in. It took a very long time, historically speaking, for anyone to try studying this inner voice, the way you might study anything else that can be observed and measured, and even then, the earliest attempts ran into trouble almost immediately. In the late 1800s, as psychology was first trying to establish itself as its own field of science, separate from philosophy, one of the main tools researchers reached for was something called introspection, which amounted to training people to watch their own minds very closely and report back exactly what they found there. Wilhelm Wundt, working in Leipzig, and later others working in laboratories in the United States, would ask carefully trained observers to describe the raw contents of their consciousness in response to some simple stimulus, a sound, a light, a word, hoping that if enough people reported their inner experience carefully enough, a kind of shared map of the mind would gradually emerge. It did not quite work out that way. Different laboratories, using what were meant to be the same methods, kept arriving at strikingly different conclusions about what thought was actually made of. One especially heated argument, sometimes remembered as the imageless thought controversy, broke out between researchers in Germany and researchers elsewhere over whether it was even possible to think something without any accompanying mental image or word at all, some insisting that pure, wordless, imageless thought clearly existed, others insisting just as firmly that it did not, that if you looked closely enough you would always find some sensory residue, some fragment of language or picture, attached to every thought a person had. Neither side could conclusively settle the matter, because the very method they were using, careful self-observation reported afterward in words, was shaping the results before the results ever reached anyone's notebook. Asking a person to watch their own mind changes the thing being watched, in something like the way turning on a light to see whether a room is dark changes the very fact you were trying to check on. Introspection, however earnestly practiced, kept running into this problem, and by the early 1900s, many psychologists had grown weary enough of the disagreement that an entirely different school of thought was ready to sweep much of it aside. That school was behaviorism, and its central complaint was blunt. If inner experience could not be reliably observed, or agreed upon, even by trained scientists staring directly at their own minds, then perhaps psychology should stop treating inner experience as its subject matter altogether. John Watson, one of behaviorism's founding figures, went further than merely setting the inner voice aside as too difficult to study. He proposed, in the 1920s, that what people called thinking was not some ghostly mental event happening in private at all, but was instead a physical activity, tiny, almost imperceptible movements of the muscles in the throat and tongue, thought as a kind of subvocal speech, silent talking so faint it produced no audible sound but was, in his account, genuinely and literally a form of speaking, rather than a metaphor for one. It was a striking idea, precisely because it took the inner voice and made it something bodily, something that in principle could be measured with the right instruments attached to the right muscles, rather than something locked away where no outside observer could ever reach it. Later experiments complicated this picture considerably, since people who had lost the ability to move those throat muscles entirely could still report thinking in words, but Watson's instinct, that inner speech might be tangled up with the body's own machinery for producing spoken language, turned out to contain a thread worth following, even after his stricter version of the theory fell out of favor. It was around this same general era, though from a very different angle, that a Russian psychologist named Lev Vygotsky began building an account of the inner voice that would end up shaping the field for the rest of the century, an account grounded not in adult introspection or laboratory throat muscles, but in watching children. Vygotsky noticed something that any patient adult who has spent time around a small child might also notice if they happen to be listening closely. Young children, absorbed in play, often talk to themselves out loud, narrating their own actions, coaching themselves through a task, muttering instructions to a toy, or to no one in particular, apparently unconcerned that anyone else might hear. Vygotsky proposed that this out-loud self-talk was not some meaningless babble to be outgrown, but an early, external version of exactly the same process that would later become the silent inner voice, gradually turning inward as the child matured, the words shrinking, quieting, folding into private, wordless shorthand, until what had once been spoken aloud for the whole room to hear was audible only inside the child's own head. In his account, thinking in words was not something a person was simply born doing quietly. It was something first learned socially, out loud, in conversation with other people, before it slowly withdrew inward and became a kind of conversation continued alone.
To understand what Vygotsky meant by a conversation continued alone, it helps to slow down something that ordinarily happens without a moment's thought, and watch what has to occur underneath a single spoken sentence, in the narrow space between having something to say and actually hearing yourself say it. Picture someone standing in a kitchen, deciding to ask a person across the room what time it is. Before any sound exists, there is only an idea, something closer to a shape than to words, a kind of directed curiosity about time that has not yet been dressed in any particular language. This is the first stage, and it is worth noticing because it is not yet English, or Spanish, or Mandarin, or anything else. It is closer to an intention, a small pressure toward communication, and researchers who study language production generally agree that this pre-verbal layer exists, even if they argue endlessly about how to describe it. Only after that comes the search for words, and this is a stage most people have felt directly, usually at its most frustrating moments, when a familiar word hovers just out of reach. Psychologists in the 1960s, studying what they called the tip of the tongue phenomenon, found that people in this state could often report the number of syllables in the missing word, or its first letter, or a word that sounded similar, long before the word itself arrived, which suggested that finding a word is not one instant event, but a kind of narrowing search through a crowded drawer, feeling past nearby tools before the right one comes to hand. Once words are found, they still have to be arranged, and this is where grammar enters, quietly and almost invisibly, assembling subject and verb and object into an order that will make sense to another mind. A person does not consciously decide to put the verb before the object in English or after it in Japanese. That ordering happens automatically, shaped by a language learned so early that its rules feel less like rules and more like the natural shape of thought itself. Only after an idea has been sorted into words, and those words have been arranged into a grammatical sequence, does the plan become something closer to an instruction set for the body, a detailed choreography specifying which sounds come first, how long each should last, where the stress should fall. The psychologist Carl Lashley, writing in the middle of the 20th century, was struck by how fast
and how orderly this choreography had to be, since spoken syllables tumble out at a rate too quick to be managed one at a time by conscious deliberation. Something, he argued, had to be planning several steps ahead, the way a skilled typist's fingers are already moving toward the next letters before the current one has finished landing. From there, the plan has to leave the realm of ideas altogether and enter the realm of muscle and air. Breath comes first, and it is easy to forget how much of speaking is really a controlled form of exhaling. The diaphragm and the muscles between the ribs work together like a bellows, pushing air upward through the windpipe in a steady, regulated stream, timed precisely enough that a person can speak a full sentence on a single breath without running out partway through, or without so much air rushing out at once that the sentence collapses into a gasp. That column of air then meets the larynx, sitting at the top of the windpipe, home to two small folds of tissue that can be pulled taut or left slack, depending on what sound is needed.
When the vocal folds are drawn together and the air pushes through them, they vibrate hundreds of times each second for an adult voice, the way a reed vibrates in a woodwind instrument or a blade of grass hums when air is forced across it, and that vibration is the raw material from which the voice will be built. Everything above the larynx then works to shape that raw hum into recognizable speech. The tongue rises and falls and curls, the lips round or spread or press together and release. The soft palate lifts or drops to let air escape through the nose or seal it off entirely, and all of this happens in a matter of milliseconds, dozens of separate muscles adjusting position many times each second, more precisely coordinated than almost any other physical skill a human body performs. And even once a sound leaves the mouth, the process is not finished, because the speaker is also, at every moment, listening to themselves. Sound travels back through the air to the ears, but it also travels through the bones and tissue of the head itself, which is part of why a person's recorded voice can sound strange and unfamiliar to them, missing that inner resonance they are used to hearing from the inside. This return signal matters enormously because it lets a speaker correct course in real time, catching a slip before it becomes a stumble, adjusting volume in a noisy room, softening a word that came out too sharp. Researchers in the 1950s discovered just how important this feedback loop was by an odd experiment, one where a person's own voice was played back to them through headphones with a small delay of a fraction of a second, just enough of a gap to throw the feedback out of sync with the speaking. People in this situation, otherwise entirely fluent, would suddenly stumble, repeat syllables, slow down, speak as though they had developed a stutter on the spot, simply because the sound arriving in their ears no longer matched the plan their brain expected to hear. Speaking, it turns out, is not a one-way broadcast. It is a loop, constantly checked against itself. So an ordinary spoken sentence passes through all of these stations, one after another, in well under a second, from a vague pre-verbal intention, through word selection, through grammar, through a detailed motor plan, out through breath and larynx, and tongue and lips, and back in again through the ears, checked and adjusted along the way. When researchers began asking what an internal voice might be doing, this whole pipeline became a useful map, because the natural question was not whether inner speech was some mysterious separate faculty, but which of these familiar stations it actually visits, and where along the route it quietly stops. The evidence gathered over the following decades pointed toward an answer that is neither simple
nor strange, once you sit with it. Inner speech appears to travel through much of the same early machinery as spoken language, the pre-verbal intention, the search through the drawer of words, the grammatical assembly, and in many cases, even a detailed motor plan, drafted with real specificity about how the sentence would sound and feel if it were spoken aloud. What seems to change, or at least to be sharply reduced, is what happens after that plan is finished, at the handoff point, where instructions would ordinarily be sent down to the breath and the larynx and the tongue. In the 1930s, a physiologist named Edmund Jacobson, using instruments sensitive enough to detect the faintest electrical activity in muscle tissue, found that when people were asked simply to imagine performing a physical action, tiny corresponding signals sometimes appeared in the very muscles that would have carried out that action. Whisper quiet traces of a movement that never actually happened. Something similar seems to be true of inner speech, for at least some people, some of the time. A faint rehearsal, humming through the vocal apparatus, without ever building to the point of producing sound, rather like a pianist, running through a passage, with their fingers hovering just above the keys, feeling the shape of the music, without ever pressing down. What makes this more than a passing curiosity is the question of why the plan stops there at all, why the brain would go to the trouble of drafting such a detailed instruction set, only to quietly set it aside before delivery, and what exactly does the setting aside, since nothing about drafting a plan implies that its execution will be blocked automatically.
One of the clearest places to watch this rehearsal at work, rather than simply infer it from faint electrical traces, is in the ordinary business of holding something in mind for a few seconds. Think of what happens when someone reads a phone number aloud and you have no pen, no way to write it down before you dial. You do not store the digits the way a photograph stores a scene, all at once and intact. Instead, you say them to yourself, over and over, in a loop, 7 digits chasing their own tails through something that behaves very much like a small, tireless echo chamber. If someone interrupts you in that moment, if they ask you an unrelated question or simply talk over your rehearsal, the number tends to scatter, as though the loop had been broken mid-turn and the digits fell out where the break occurred. This everyday experience became the subject of careful laboratory study starting in the early 1970s, when a British psychologist named Alan Baddeley, working with his colleague Graham Hitch, proposed that short-term verbal memory was not a single undifferentiated bin where information sat passively, but a small working system with distinct moving parts. One part they called the phonological store, a kind of brief holding pen where sound-based information could linger for a couple of seconds before fading, the way a ripple on a pond flattens out if nothing renews it. The other part they called the articulatory rehearsal process, and this is the part that matters most for our purposes tonight, because its entire job is to refresh the fading trace by silently re-articulating it, saying it again, inside, before it has the chance to disappear. It is not unlike keeping a candle lit in a drafty room by cupping your hand around the flame and feeding it your breath at intervals, a small continuous act of maintenance rather than one act of storage. What made this idea more than an appealing metaphor was a set of experiments that could interfere with the rehearsal directly and watch what broke. Researchers asked people to hold a short list of words in mind while simultaneously repeating an irrelevant sound out loud, something meaningless like the, or a nonsense syllable, over and over, as fast as they could manage. This technique came to be called articulatory suppression, and its effect was strikingly specific. It did not damage memory in general.
People could still remember pictures, still remember the general gist of a story, still recognize faces they had seen minutes before. What it damaged, and damaged badly, was memory, for the precise sound of things, for strings of words or digits or letters that needed to be held in their exact original order. Force the mouth to babble nonsense, even silently in some versions of the experiment, and the inner rehearsal loop simply had nowhere to run, no channel left free to carry it, and the list crumbled the way sand crumbles when you try to hold it too loosely. An earlier line of research, from a psychologist named Reginald Conrad, working in the 1960s, had already hinted at where this rehearsal loop actually stores its information, and the hint was almost accidental. Conrad noticed that when people made errors recalling short lists of letters, the errors were not random. Someone trying to remember the letter B was far more likely to mistakenly say V, or P, or D, than to say a visually similar letter like R, or a letter that meant something similar in some other sense. The mistakes clustered by sound, not by shape or meaning, which told him that whatever was holding the letters in mind was encoding them acoustically as something closer to how they sound than how they look on a page. This is a small detail, but it carries a large implication. Even when nothing has been spoken aloud, even when the letters were only seen printed on cards, the mind seems to translate them into a sound-based code to hold on to them, converting sight into something more like hearing before it can be kept in working memory at all. Which brings the story naturally to reading, and to something almost everyone has experienced without ever pausing to examine it. When you read silently, especially when you read something unfamiliar or dense, or written in an unusual voice, there is very often a faint sense of the words being sounded out, a whisper of pronunciation running just beneath conscious attention. Skilled readers can suppress this to varying degrees, skimming with barely a trace of it, but it rarely vanishes entirely, and it tends to surge back the moment the material gets difficult, the moment a sentence is long, or a word is unfamiliar, or a passage of poetry asks to be felt in the mouth as much as understood by the eye. Researchers have shown that articulatory suppression, that same trick of babbling nonsense syllables while performing a task, slows silent reading and disrupts memory for what was read, especially for material where the exact wording matters, like a line of verse or a piece of dialogue, rather than only the general meaning. It is as though understanding language on the page borrows, at least partly, machinery that was built for the ear and the mouth, machinery that never quite forgot its original purpose, even after literacy repurposed it for silent, solitary use.
All of this gives the phonological loop a fairly concrete, almost mechanical feel, and it is tempting, once you have it in mind, to picture inner speech itself as something close to a tape recorder, a small internal cassette that plays back sounds you have heard or rehearsed, looping the same track until something interrupts it or the batteries run low. The metaphor is useful, and it is not entirely wrong, but it starts to strain and eventually break the moment you push on it too hard. A tape recording is fixed. It plays back exactly what was recorded, in the same order, at roughly the same pace, every time. Inner speech is nothing like this. It edits itself as it goes. It skips ahead, compresses whole sentences into a single word or a private shorthand, argues with itself, contradicts its own previous line, and very often produces things that were never spoken by anyone in the first place. Sentences composed fresh in the moment, sentences that belong to nobody's memory because they did not exist until that instant of thinking them. A recording cannot invent, it can only repeat.
Whatever is happening when you silently compose a sentence you have never said before, when you rehearse an argument you plan to have tomorrow, or quietly correct your own grammar as you think through a problem, this is closer to live production than to playback, closer to a musician improvising than to a listener replaying a favorite song. There is a second way the recording metaphor falls short, and it has to do with how condensed and abbreviated inner speech tends to become with practice. Lev Vygotsky, the Russian psychologist whose work on this subject spanned the 1920s and early 1930s, argued that inner speech is not simply spoken language turned down to a whisper. It is spoken language that has been reshaped for an audience of exactly one. When you talk to another person, you have to spell things out, provide context they do not already have, follow the ordinary grammar that lets a stranger's mind track your meaning. When you talk to yourself, none of that scaffolding is necessary because the listener already knows everything the speaker knows. Vygotsky suggested that inner speech, left to its own devices, tends to shed subjects, shed connecting words, shed whole explanatory phrases, becoming a kind of compressed, almost telegraphic code where a single word or fragment can stand in for an entire train of thought that would take a full paragraph to say out loud to someone else. A tape recording cannot compress itself this way. It cannot decide, on its own, to skip the boring parts, but a mind talking to itself apparently can, and often does, which suggests that what plays out in that quiet stream is being generated and pruned in real time by something considerably more active and considerably more idiosyncratic than any simple mechanism for replaying stored sound. So if inner speech is not quite hearing and not quite a recording, something closer to a live, self-editing performance staged for an audience of one, the next question worth sitting with is how it manages to sound like anything at all, how a process this compressed and this private still arrives, for most people, dressed in a recognizable voice, complete with tone and rhythm, and something that feels unmistakably like a person speaking.
Turning to the brain itself, hoping it might settle what introspection alone cannot, feels like a reasonable next step. And for a while, brain science seemed poised to do exactly that. Surely, the thinking went, if you could just get a person into a scanner and have them think a sentence to themselves, you would see it. A single region lighting up, a kind of switchboard, the physical seat of the inner voice, waiting to be found the way explorers once expected to find the source of a river by simply following it upstream long enough. What researchers found instead was messier, and in its own way more interesting, because it turns out there is no such switchboard. There is no one place in the brain that turns on when you talk to yourself and stays dark the rest of the time. Instead, there is a wide, loosely coordinated collection of regions, each doing its own specialized work, none of them sufficient on its own, all of them cooperating in a way that resembles an orchestra far more than a soloist. Some of the oldest evidence for this comes not from scanners at all, but from 19th century clinical observation, long before anyone could watch a living brain at work. In 1861, a French physician named Paul Broca examined a patient known ever after by the nickname his condition gave him, Tan, because that single syllable was nearly all the man could say aloud, despite seeming to understand everything said to him. After the patient died, Broca examined his brain and found damage to a specific patch of the left frontal lobe, a region that now bears his name. A decade later, a German neurologist named Karl Wernicke described a different kind of patient, one who could produce fluent strings of speech, but whose words failed to add up to meaning, and traced that trouble to a different patch of tissue, this one further back, in the temporal lobe. For a long time, the tidy textbook story was that Broca's area handled the making of language, and Wernicke's area handled the understanding of it. Two stations on a simple assembly line. Modern imaging has complicated that story considerably, showing that both regions, along with the fibers connecting them and several of their neighbors, form something closer to a network than a pair of dedicated offices. And what matters for tonight's purposes is that this same network, the one damaged in Tan and in Wernicke's patient, shows measurable activity not only when people speak or listen, but when they merely imagine speaking, silently, to no one. The motor side of the story has its own history and its own useful correction. In the early 1900s, the American psychologist John B. Watson, one of the founders of a school of thought called behaviorism, proposed something wonderfully direct, that thinking simply was talking, just talking so quietly that the muscles of the throat and tongue moved without producing audible sound. Watson believed that if you attached sensitive enough instruments to a person's vocal apparatus, you could catch thought in the act, as a flicker of tiny muscular twitches. There was something appealing about the simplicity of this, and something misleading about it too, and the test that mostly settled the matter came a few decades later, in 1947, when researchers named Smith, Brown, and Toman gave volunteers a paralytic drug related to curare, the substance used on poison darts, strong enough to stop all voluntary muscle movement, including in the throat, while leaving consciousness intact through artificial breathing. If Watson had been exactly right, thought itself should have gone silent, along with the muscles. It did not. The volunteers, once the paralysis wore off, reported that they had gone on thinking in words the entire time, inner speech, fully intact, riding along with no muscular flicker to carry it. So the throat and tongue are not uninvolved, exactly. Subtler measurements do still pick up faint electrical activity there during silent thought, a kind of ghost of the motor commands that would produce actual speech, and some researchers think this residue plays a real role in shaping how inner speech feels. But it is clearly not the whole engine. Something upstream is doing most of the work, and it survives even when the body's speaking machinery is switched off entirely. Auditory cortex adds another piece, and a rather poetic one, to how a wordless thought comes to sound like something at all. Brain imaging studies of people asked to imagine hearing a voice, or to silently rehearse a sentence, consistently show activity rising in regions of the temporal lobe associated with processing sound, particularly the secondary auditory areas that handle the interpretation of speech rather than the earliest raw registration of it. This overlap between imagined and actual hearing is not merely a modern discovery made possible by scanners. Decades earlier, a Canadian neurosurgeon named Wilder Penfield, operating on the exposed, awake brains of epilepsy patients at the Montreal Neurological Institute through the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, in order to map safe surgical boundaries, found that mild electrical stimulation applied directly to certain points on the temporal lobe could cause a patient, lying conscious on the table, to suddenly hear a remembered voice or a snatch of music, vivid and specific, as though a phonograph had been switched on inside the skull.
Penfield's patients were not imagining anything on purpose. The sound arrived unbidden, produced by the tissue itself under a small jolt of current. It was some of the earliest direct evidence that the felt experience of hearing something, complete with tone and cadence, can be generated from the inside by cortex
that ordinarily processes sound coming from the outside, with no ear or air or actual acoustic event required at all. None of this activity happens in isolation from the parts of the brain concerned with attention, effort, and self-direction, and this is where things loop back toward Vygotsky's old observation about inner speech serving as a tool for guiding one's own behavior. Regions in the prefrontal cortex, involved broadly in planning and in monitoring ongoing mental activity, along with structures like the anterior cingulate that help track when a task requires extra vigilance, tend to become more active during exactly the kinds of inner speech that feel most effortful and most deliberate, talking yourself through an unfamiliar recipe, rehearsing what you'll say in a difficult conversation, holding a phone number in mind by repeating it. Inner speech that is idle and wandering looks different, in these studies, from inner speech that is being put to work, which fits the intuition that self-talk is not a single uniform hum, but something that shifts in intensity depending on what you are asking it to do. Studies of disruption round out the picture, and they are worth treating carefully because they tend to be dissociations rather than clean proofs. There are documented cases of people who, after a stroke affecting classic language regions, lose most or all of their capacity for spoken language, a condition called aphasia, yet still perform, on careful testing, as though some inner linguistic process survives, guiding them through tasks that seem to require silently structured thought, even though they cannot say a sentence aloud. There are other cases, rarer and less thoroughly studied, of people who report the opposite, fluent outer speech, but a strange new quiet where an inner monologue used to be, following damage elsewhere in the brain. Findings like these suggest that the networks supporting inner and outer speech overlap substantially without being identical, which is a very different, more textured claim than saying scientists have located a single inner voice organ that outer speech simply borrows. It's worth sitting for a moment with what this kind of evidence can and cannot tell you. A brain scan showing a region lighting up during silent thought tells you where blood flow and electrical activity happen to increase, while a person did a task in a scanner, under artificial conditions, often while holding very still and thinking about not moving. It does not, by itself, tell you what that activity feels like from the inside, whether it constitutes a single unified experience or several separate ones running in parallel, or why some of that activity crosses the threshold into something a person notices at all, while so much other brain activity, just as real, stays entirely below awareness. Imaging can show you where the orchestra members are sitting. It is much less good at explaining how their separate parts add up to the specific, private melody that only the listener inside that particular skull ever actually hears.
Let's turn now to a different kind of evidence, not scans or lesion studies, but simple, patient observation of children, the sort of watching and listening that requires no machine at all, just a notebook and an afternoon spent near a sandbox or a set of wooden blocks. If you have ever spent real time around a 2- or 3-year-old, you may have noticed something that looks, at first, like the child is talking to no one. A toddler, stacking blocks, might say, out loud, in a small, clear voice, up, careful, oops, again. A child, pouring imaginary tea, might narrate the whole scene aloud. More tea, hot, blow on it, good. Adults sometimes worry when they overhear this, wondering if it signals something unusual, but it does not. It is, by all available evidence, an entirely ordinary and in fact necessary part of how a young human mind organizes itself. Psychologists call it private speech, and one of the people most responsible for taking it seriously rather than dismissing it as babble, was a Russian psychologist named Lev Vygotsky, working in Moscow in the years around 1930 in a research culture that was, at the time, unusually interested in how mental abilities grow out of social life rather than simply unfolding from some fixed inner blueprint. Vygotsky's proposal, built on careful observation of children at play, was that a young child's earliest use of language is almost entirely social. It exists to communicate with someone else, a parent, a sibling, a caregiver, and its whole purpose is to move information and feeling from one person. Somewhere in the early preschool years, though, something shifts. The child begins directing some of that same language, not outward, at a listener, but at themselves, using words to guide their own hands, their own attention, their own next move. A child struggling to fit a puzzle piece might mutter, "Not this one, try the other way," there, as though coaching a smaller, less capable version of themselves through the task. This talking to oneself out loud is not, on this account, a delay or a failure to socialize properly. It is speech, doing a new job. It has been borrowed from its original purpose, moving a thought from one mind to another and repurposed for a second, quieter job, moving a thought from one moment of a single mind to the next moment of that same mind. What tends to happen after that, over the following few years, is a kind of gradual folding inward, and it is worth picturing slowly, the way you might picture a piece of paper being creased smaller and smaller. A 4-year-old's private speech is often loud and complete, full sentences said clearly enough that anyone standing nearby could follow along. By 5 or 6, the same running commentary tends to grow quieter, more clipped, more like fragments than full sentences, single words standing in for whole thoughts, mumbled rather than spoken. By the time most children reach the early years of school, somewhere around 7 or 8, this narration has largely gone silent altogether, at least to outside ears, though researchers who have studied this transition carefully suspect it has not disappeared so much as gone underground, continuing on the inside in a compressed, telegraphic form that no longer needs full sentences because the child speaking to themselves already knows exactly what they mean and does not need to spell it out, the way you might leave yourself a note that just says, "Milk, eggs, call mom," rather than a full paragraph explaining who these people are and why the errands matter.
The audience for this inner talk, after all, is a single, extremely well-informed listener, one who already shares every relevant memory and intention with the speaker, because they are the same person. This is a useful moment to notice how ordinary situations still nudge that inward voice back out into the open, even in adults who have long since stopped narrating their block towers aloud. Watch someone doing a genuinely difficult, unfamiliar task, threading a needle, parking a trailer in a tight space, following a complicated recipe for the first time, and you will often hear scraps of speech returning, a murmured, "Okay, now turn," or a bit further, there. Difficulty, novelty, and high stakes all seem to push private speech back toward the surface, as though the fully condensed, silent version works fine for familiar ground, but needs to unfold again, like origami paper being pressed flat, when the task is unfamiliar enough that a person genuinely benefits from the slower, more explicit structure that spoken-out language provides. Sports coaches and driving instructors sometimes exploit this directly, encouraging a learner to talk themselves through a new movement out loud, not because the words themselves move the muscles, but because saying the steps aloud
seems to help hold them in order, at least until the sequence becomes automatic enough that inner speech, or perhaps no language at all, can carry the same load with less effort.
Children growing up with more than one language add an interesting complication to this picture, and it is one that researchers are still working through with care rather than certainty. Some studies of bilingual and multilingual children suggest that their private speech in the preschool years sometimes mixes languages within a single sentence, switching from one to the other mid-thought in a way that mirrors how the two languages get used around them at home and in the wider world. Other observations suggest that children may settle into using whichever language feels most natural for the particular kind of thinking at hand, counting in the language they learned counting in, comforting themselves in the language a parent used at bedtime. What almost nobody in this research area claims, and what is worth being honest about, is that the picture is fully settled. Bilingual inner speech is an area of real, ongoing scientific interest, and different studies, using different methods with different children in different language communities, have produced a genuinely mixed set of findings rather than one clean, consistent story. This naturally raises a bigger, older question, one that reaches well beyond childhood development into a debate that has occupied linguists and psychologists for the better part of a century. If the words available to you shape the very shape of your thinking, what happens to a mind that grows up with 2 or 3 different sets of words for carving up the same world? This idea, that language might shape or constrain thought, is sometimes called linguistic relativity, and it is closely associated with 2 American linguists working in the early and middle 20th century, Edward Sapir and his student Benjamin Lee Whorf. Whorf, notably, worked for years as a fire prevention inspector for an insurance company, and some of his interest in how language shapes perception reportedly grew out of noticing how the words people used to describe things, like calling a drum of what they assumed was empty gasoline still an empty drum, seemed to shape how carelessly they treated real, lingering danger. The strongest version of this idea, the claim that language rigidly determines what a person can think, so that a concept simply missing from your vocabulary becomes a concept you are incapable of having at all, has not held up well under later scrutiny, and most researchers today treat it as overstated. People without a specific word for a particular shade of blue can still see that blue, still distinguish it from a neighboring shade in careful testing, still learn a new word for it in a matter of minutes if someone offers one, but a softer, more modest version of the idea has fared much better, and it is worth sitting with because it is more interesting than either extreme. Language does not seem to lock the doors of thought, but it does appear to shape which doors a person tends to walk through first, which distinctions come to mind quickly and effortlessly, and which require more deliberate, effortful noticing. Speakers of languages with elaborate systems for describing spatial direction, for instance, some Aboriginal Australian languages among them, tend to track compass directions with remarkable, almost constant precision, a habit of attention that seems to follow naturally from a lifetime of needing those words. None of this means their minds work in some fundamentally different architecture from anyone else's. It means that the grooves worn into a mind by a lifetime of a particular language are real without being a cage. And that distinction between a nudge and a wall turns out to matter quite a lot for understanding what that quiet inner voice is actually doing night after night as it keeps murmuring on in whichever language or languages first taught it how to speak. Which brings us, gently, to a question worth turning over in the dark. What is that inner voice actually for? Not in some grand philosophical sense, but practically. What jobs does it do, hour by hour, that make it worth the metabolic cost of running a small narrator inside your own skull? Because it does seem to be worth the cost. Something that persistent, that hard to switch off even when you want quiet, is probably not just noise. It is more like a tool that got left running because it keeps being useful, in more ways than most people ever pause to count. Start with planning, since it is the most obvious one and the easiest to catch yourself doing. Think of the last time you stood in a kitchen deciding what to make for dinner with only a few ingredients on hand. There is a reasonable chance you did not simply reach for the pan. You talked yourself through it first. If I use the last of the onion here, then I won't have any for tomorrow, so maybe the peppers instead, and then I'll need to remember to thaw something for the second half of the week. That is inner speech, doing what researchers call sequencing, holding a string of hypothetical steps in mind long enough to compare them, testing one imagined future against another before committing your body to either. A recipe on a page can only tell you what to do. The voice in your head is what lets you improvise a plan that does not exist anywhere on paper yet. Self-control leans on very similar machinery, though it can feel different from the inside. The small, sharp command, "not now," or the reminder that you already ate, or the private negotiation of just 5 more minutes and then I stop. These are inner speech, standing in for a kind of internal supervisor. Some developmental psychologists, building on the same tradition of thought that gave us the idea of speech first spoken aloud by children and then folded inward, have suggested that this self-directed talk is one of the main ways a young mind first learns to govern its own impulses at all. A toddler saying no, don't touch out loud, while reaching toward something forbidden is, in a very real sense, borrowing the voice of a parent and wearing it temporarily as their own, using someone else's old instruction as a kind of scaffolding until they can build the same restraint without needing to say it aloud. By adulthood, that scaffolding has mostly gone silent, moved inward, but the structure it built is still standing, and you can hear its echo any time you talk yourself out of the second slice of cake or into finishing one more task before bed. Memory gets a similar assist, though it works a little differently depending on what is being remembered. Say a phone number to yourself while you cross the room to find a pen, and you are using inner speech, the way a bucket brigade uses a line of people passing water hand to hand, keeping information alive by repeating it just long enough to set it down somewhere safer. That particular trick, sometimes called the phonological loop by researchers who study working memory, seems to have a fairly narrow capacity and a fairly short fuse, which is part of why a 7-digit phone number used to sit near the edge of what most people could hold on to reliably, and why area codes tacked on additional strain. But inner speech also helps with a slower, deeper kind of remembering, the kind where narrating an event to yourself while it happens, or shortly after, seems to help stitch it into a more durable, retrievable story. People who talk through their day in their heads before sleep, turning the day's events into a rough narrative, often find those events easier to recall later than people who let the same day pass by unnarrated. The telling itself seems to do some of the binding work. Then there is a use of inner speech that gets less attention than it probably deserves, which is moral rehearsal. The quiet run-through of a difficult conversation before it happens, imagining what you might say,
If a friend brings up the thing you have been avoiding, or drafting, sentence by sentence, an apology you are not sure you are ready to give out loud. This is not idle worry, though it can certainly tip into that. At its best, it functions something like a rehearsal room, a private space where you can try out different versions of yourself, harsher or gentler, more honest or more careful, and see how each one sounds before you commit to one in front of another person. Actors do something structurally similar when they run lines alone before a performance, except here, you are both the actor and the audience, testing your own words against your own private sense of whether they ring true. Problem solving borrows from several of these at once. There is a reason so many people report their best ideas arriving not at the desk, but in the shower, or on a walk, or in the strange, loosened half-attention of lying in bed with the lights already off. Inner speech seems to work differently when a task is not squarely in front of you demanding an answer right now. Away from the pressure of an immediate deadline, the same quiet voice that plans dinner or rehearses apologies can wander into looser, more associative territory, turning a problem over the way a hand turns a stone, without any urgent need to solve it. Sometimes, it is in that loosened, unforced state that a stuck problem quietly resolves, the pieces sliding into place. This has led some researchers to wonder whether part of what makes bedtime so productive for certain kinds of thinking is not extra effort at all, but the opposite, a kind of permission to stop pushing and let the inner voice range more freely. Inner speech also threads through imagination, though there its role is often to narrate images that arrive first from somewhere quieter, filling in the words for scenes that begin as more purely visual or sensory, and it shows up in emotional regulation, in the specific, well-studied habit of talking yourself down after something upsetting, sometimes literally, in the second or third person, saying your own name to yourself, the way a friend would say it. There is real evidence that this small shift, from "I am overwhelmed" to a phrase like, "Okay, you've got this," using your own name, the way someone else might use it, seems to create just enough psychological distance to make an intense feeling easier to sit with. It is a strange, almost sleight of hand trick, addressing yourself as though you were someone else for just long enough to think more clearly. And it can carry music too, which is worth pausing on, since it does not fit neatly into any of the categories above. A tune, stuck in your head, replaying a chorus you did not choose to think about, uses some of the same inner voicing machinery as spoken thought, which is part of why a persistent earworm can feel so much like an unwanted guest in the same room where your other thoughts are trying to work. Researchers who study this sometimes call it involuntary musical imagery, and it appears to recruit much of the same inner ear that lets you silently reread a line of a poem and hear its rhythm. All of which is to say, the inner voice is less like one gadget doing one job than a well-worn multi-tool picked up and put down for a dozen different tasks throughout an ordinary day. And it is exactly because it is so useful, so often, for so many different purposes, that it can start to feel tiring. Not every use of that voice is doing something as clearly purposeful as sequencing a recipe or memorizing a phone number. Some of what it does at night, in particular, is closer to a habit, running on its own momentum, narrating without being asked to, circling back over the same worry, the way a fingertip returns again and again to a small rough spot on a table's edge. That is worth looking at more closely, because the difference between a tool that is working and a habit that has simply worn its own groove is not always obvious from the inside, especially in the dark, especially when the mind has had all day to practice.
Let's sit with a question that sounds almost too obvious to ask. When that inner voice speaks, why does it feel like yours? Not just present in your head, but authored by you, originating from some quiet control room behind your eyes, rather than arriving from somewhere else. It is such a basic feature of the experience that most people never pause on it, the same way you rarely pause to notice that your own reflection moves exactly when you do. But that sense of ownership, that quiet certainty of, "I said that," is not free. It turns out to be something the brain actively constructs, moment by moment, and the machinery involved is some of the same machinery that lets you tell the difference between a world that is happening to you and a world you are making happen yourself. Here is a way into it that has nothing to do with thinking at all, at least not at first. Try, gently, to tickle yourself. Most people cannot manage it, not really, not the way a sibling or a friend can with the same fingers on the same ribs. This has been studied properly, in laboratories, with actual tickling machines built to deliver a precisely timed touch to the sole of a foot or the palm of a hand. And the finding holds up again and again. A touch that arrives from your own hand, moved by your own intention, registers as smaller, blunter, less startling than the identical touch delivered by someone else, or by a machine, or even by your own hand, moved with a slight, deceptive delay. Add just a fraction of a second of lag between the movement you make and the touch you feel, and the ticklishness creeps back in. The touch stops feeling fully yours. The explanation that researchers have converged on borrows a term from an old idea in neuroscience, one that actually predates modern brain imaging by decades. It is called efference copy, and the phrase is a little clunky, but the concept is not. Whenever your brain sends a command out to a muscle, telling your hand to move, telling your foot to step, telling your vocal cords to shape a syllable, it does not just send that single instruction and wait to see what happens. It keeps a copy for itself, a kind of carbon copy of the outgoing order, filed away internally at the exact moment the real command goes out to the body. That copy then gets used to predict what the resulting sensation ought to feel like, an instant before the sensation actually arrives. If your hand is about to touch your own ribs, the brain has already, in some sense, drafted a preview of that touch, generated from the movement command itself, before your skin ever reports back that contact occurred. When the real sensation shows up, the brain compares it against that preview. And if the two match closely enough, timing lined up, location lined up, pressure roughly as expected, the brain treats the sensation as old news, already accounted for. Nothing here that needs urgent attention, because it predicted this. This dampening effect has a name too, sensory attenuation, and it is not laziness or inattention on the brain's part. It is closer to efficiency, a kind of triage. The nervous system has limited resources for flagging things as important, and a touch you produced yourself, entirely expected in its timing and quality,
simply is not the kind of event that warrants a loud alarm. A touch from someone else, unpredicted, without any accompanying efference copy to check it against, arrives with no such discount. It gets the full, unblunted signal, which is most of the reason a stranger's tap on your shoulder can make you flinch in a way your own hand never would. Now here is where it gets interesting for a voice rather than a touch. Speech, even silent speech, even the kind that never moves your lips or vibrates your vocal cords at all, appears to involve something structurally similar. When your brain generates an inner utterance, it is, in a real sense, issuing a motor-like command, a plan for an utterance, even if that plan is never carried out on actual muscles. And along with that plan, something very much like an efference copy seems to be generated too, a prediction of what that inner utterance should sound like, should feel like, arriving just ahead of the experience of actually hearing it in your mind. When the predicted version and the experienced version match up closely, the result is a thought that registers as fluently, unmistakably self-generated, mine, expected, nothing alarming here. This is where a word like agency becomes useful, though it is worth being careful with it, because it means something fairly specific in this context. The sense of agency is not the same as agency itself, not the same as actually being the cause of something. It is the feeling of having caused it, which is a separate matter, built by the brain after the fact, or sometimes even in anticipation, based on cues like timing and fit between prediction and outcome.
Under most conditions, those two things, the actual causing and the feeling of having caused, line up so well that no one ever notices they are separable at all. But researchers have found ways to pull them apart in the lab, using tasks where a person's hand movements are subtly altered by a computer, or where a small delay is inserted between an action and its visible result. People will often still feel a sense of ownership over outcomes that were not quite theirs, so long as the timing and the rough shape of the prediction were close enough. The brain, it turns out, is not checking for perfect truth. It is checking for good enough fit. This idea has been especially useful and especially studied in trying to understand experiences where that fit seems to break down. In certain psychotic conditions, some researchers have proposed, the mechanism that generates efference copies for inner speech, or the mechanism that compares prediction against experience, may not be working quite as smoothly. If the predicted preview of an inner utterance fails to match the experienced version closely enough, or if the prediction simply is not generated at all, the resulting thought might not carry that automatic stamp of mine. It could, in principle, feel foreign, externally sourced, not remembered as something you thought, but experienced as something said to you. This is one leading hypothesis, worth naming carefully as a hypothesis, actively studied and still debated, rather than a settled fact, and it does not explain every case or every person's experience. But it is a serious and influential idea in the field, precisely because it takes something ordinary, the ordinary machinery that keeps you from tickling yourself, and shows how its disruption might illuminate something as extraordinary and as difficult as hearing a voice that does not feel like your own. It is worth sitting for a moment with how strange this whole arrangement really is, once you notice it. The feeling that a thought is yours is not a direct readout of some deeper truth stamped onto the thought itself. It is closer to a judgment your brain is constantly, quietly making, using timing and prediction and fit, the same kind of judgment it uses to decide whether a touch on your ribs deserves a flinch or a shrug. Most of the time this judgment is made so quickly and so accurately that it never rises to conscious notice at all.
You simply think, and the thought arrives pre-labeled as yours, the way a letter arrives already addressed. But underneath that seamless labeling is an entire predictive apparatus, generating a preview, checking it against the real thing, deciding, in effect, whether to sound the alarm or let the moment pass quietly. And once you know that apparatus is there, it becomes a little easier to imagine what might happen when a thought slips through without a full match, or arrives just slightly out of time with its own prediction, close enough to still be a thought, but strange enough to raise a small, quiet question about where exactly it came from.
Let's slow down and take stock of the different things we've been calling, loosely, the voice in your head, because it turns out that phrase has been doing an enormous amount of quiet work, covering several genuinely different experiences, as though they were one thing. They are not one thing. They vary along more than one dimension, and it helps, gently, without any need to diagnose or categorize anyone lying here listening, to lay those dimensions out slowly and see how they overlap. Start with ordinary inner speech, the kind most people mean when they say they talk to themselves. This is the running commentary, the rehearsed sentence before a difficult phone call, the mental note to buy milk, the silent narration of your own morning. For most people who report having it, it is verbal, sequential, roughly in their own voice, and almost always felt as authored, as something they are doing, rather than something happening to them. It has a kind of grammatical shape, subject and verb, even when compressed, even when it collapses into fragments the way a hurried person's speech does, and it varies enormously from person to person. Some people report a near constant internal monologue, dense and chatty. Others report long stretches with almost none, thinking instead in images or in a kind of wordless, pre-verbal sense of meaning that only gets translated into language if they choose to say it aloud or write it down. Both of these are normal. Neither is more evolved or more intelligent than the other. It is simply that the inner life of the mind does not come standardized, and researchers who have tried to sample it, stopping people at random moments across the day and asking, quite simply, what was in your experience right before this beep, have found a startling range of answers, some rich with words, some entirely silent, some full of images that never touched language at all. Auditory imagery is a related but distinct thing, and it is worth separating carefully. This is what happens when you silently sing a song to yourself, or replay, in your mind, the specific timbre of a friend's laugh, or imagine what a trumpet would sound like if it played the next note in a melody you already know. It draws on much of the same neural machinery that processes actual sound, which is part of why a song stuck in your head can feel almost like it is playing somewhere nearby, faint but present, rather than merely being thought about in the abstract way you might think about a math problem. Auditory imagery is usually understood as a controllable, imagined act, something you can start and stop, speed up, transpose into a different key if you try. It shares ground with inner speech, since inner speech is, after all, a kind of auditory imagery of your own voice, but it is broader, covering music, environmental sounds, the remembered creak of a specific door. Which brings us, naturally, to earworms, that particular and mildly maddening cousin of auditory imagery, where a fragment of music loops on its own, without invitation, often triggered by almost nothing at all, a few notes overheard in a shop, a rhyme that happens to share a rhythm with the tune. What makes an earworm interesting, for our purposes tonight, is that it sits at an odd angle to the usual story about control. You did not choose to start it,
and often you cannot simply choose to stop it either, not by will alone, though singing it through to its ending, or replacing it with a different tune, sometimes works, the way scratching an itch works, briefly, before the itch returns. So here is a piece of inner experience that is vivid, often quite detailed right down to instrumentation, yet only partly under your control, and still, for nearly everyone who has one, felt as entirely and unmistakably yours. Nobody hearing an earworm feels that someone else has put that song in their head, even though they did not choose it and cannot easily evict it.
This matters because it shows that a loss of control, on its own, does not automatically mean a loss of the sense that a mental event belongs to you. Control and ownership are not the same dial. Intrusive thoughts work along a similar but darker axis. Nearly everyone, at some point, has had a thought arrive that feels genuinely unwanted, a violent image, an unwelcome and out-of-character impulse, a doubt phrased with disproportionate cruelty, and has been startled by it, sometimes frightened by it, precisely because it does not match how they see themselves. Decades of research on this, going back to surveys done in the 1970s and 80s, asking ordinary people, not patients, whether they had ever had a thought like this, found that the overwhelming majority had. The thought itself is common. What differs, sometimes quite a lot, is what a person does with it afterward, whether it is shrugged off as mental noise, the kind of static any complex system generates, or whether it gets seized upon, turned over, treated as evidence of something, and thereby given a second life it did not earn on its own. But here is the important detail for tonight's purposes. Even an intrusive thought, jarring and unwanted and utterly uncharacteristic, is still, for almost everyone who has one, recognized as their own mental event. Unwanted is not the same as unauthored. A thought can feel like an unwelcome guest in your own house, and still, unmistakably, be happening inside your house. And then there are voice-hearing experiences, a broader category than the clinical term auditory hallucination might suggest, because voice-hearing turns out to happen across a much wider range of circumstances than most people assume. It happens to some people in the borderland just before sleep, or just after waking, in those hypnagogic and hypnopompic minutes we have already spent some time with tonight, where a voice, sometimes a single word, sometimes a full sentence, seems to arrive from outside, spoken in a tone and cadence that does not feel like inner speech at all. It happens to some people during grief, where a significant fraction of bereaved people, in surveys conducted across different cultures, report hearing the voice of someone they lost, a phenomenon so common that clinicians who work with grief consider it an ordinary part of mourning rather than a symptom of anything. It happens to some people as part of religious or spiritual practice, where a felt sense of being addressed, sometimes verbal, sometimes more like a wordless certainty translated afterward into words, is understood within that person's own framework as meaningful rather than alarming. And it happens too, as part of certain psychiatric conditions, where voices can be frequent, distressing, and difficult to distance oneself from. Large population surveys, including ones done in the Netherlands and in Britain, have consistently found that a meaningful percentage of people with no psychiatric diagnosis at all, no need or wish for treatment, report having heard a voice, once or repeatedly, at some point in their lives. Hearing a voice, in other words, is not on its own a diagnosis. It is an experience, and like most experiences, it can arrive gently or harshly, rarely or often, welcomed or feared, depending enormously on the person and the circumstance surrounding it.
What ties all of these together, and what starts to make the whole confusing landscape a little more legible, is realizing that they differ along at least 4 separate dimensions, not one. There is vividness, how sensory and detailed and sound-like a mental event feels, ranging from a bare wisp of a thought to something with the full-bodied presence of an actual heard sound. There is controllability, whether you can start it, stop it, or shape it at will. There is location, whether it seems to originate from inside your head, from somewhere just outside it, or from a specific external direction. And there is authorship, that quieter and more fundamental question of whether the thought or sound feels like something you are doing or something happening to you. These 4 dimensions do not move in lockstep. An earworm can be vivid and location inside, and yet only weakly controllable, while still being fully authored. A grief-related voice can be vivid, location outside, uncontrollable, and yet not the least bit frightening. A racing worry at 3 in the morning can be barely vivid at all, entirely internal, fully authored, and still feel almost impossible to stop. Once you see these dimensions as separable, rather than fused, the whole territory stops looking like a single sliding scale from normal to abnormal, and starts looking like what it actually is. A wide, richly furnished room, with many different kinds of inner weather passing through it, each with its own particular texture.
Let's set that aside for a moment and turn to something that quietly unsettles the whole idea of an inner voice being the natural, default way that a mind narrates itself, because for a great many people, it isn't. Consider someone who grew up signing, a deaf person for whom American Sign Language or British Sign Language was the first language, the one that arrived not through the ears, but through the eyes and the hands of the people who raised them. Researchers who have asked deaf signers about their inner experience, people like the psychologist Margaret Wilson, working in the 1990s, have found something that should, if you think about it for a moment, seem obvious, and yet rarely occurs to people who have never considered it. Many deaf signers report an inner life that involves signing. Not a voice, not sound, but a felt sense of the hands moving, an imagined visual spatial performance happening in something like a mental stage in front of the body, sometimes accompanied by a faint, ghostly sensation in the muscles of the arms and hands, the same kind of small subvocal style activation that hearing people show in the throat when they silently talk to themselves. The inner experience, in other words, takes the shape of whatever language a person actually speaks, and for someone whose language is visual and spatial rather than acoustic, the interior monologue, if you can even still call it that, is a kind of interior dialogue of gesture. Some deaf signers describe images, some describe a sense of grammar unfolding in space without any accompanying visual picture at all, and some describe genuinely mixed experience, part image, part motion, part something harder to put words to, because of course, putting words to it assumes words are the native currency, and for them, they may not be. This should reshape how you think about anyone whose thought is not, by default, verbal at all. Because verbal inner speech, the murmuring narrator, so many people take utterly for granted, is not the only furniture a mind can be built with. Some people, hearing and speaking people, describe their thinking as overwhelmingly visual, a kind of silent cinema running behind the eyes, images assembling and dissolving into other images, with words arriving late, if at all, mostly as labels stuck onto a picture after the picture has already done its work. Albert Einstein, in a frequently cited letter to the mathematician
Jacques Hadamard, described his own productive thought as involving not words, but what he called combinatory play with signs and images, visual and even muscular in character, with conventional language entering only as a kind of translation step afterward, when it came time to explain the thought to somebody else.
Whether or not Einstein's account should be taken as a precise window into his mental machinery and memory of one's own thinking is a slippery thing to report accurately. It lines up with what many people who consider themselves visual thinkers say about their own experience, and it is a useful reminder that a narrating voice is one mode among several, not a precondition for thought itself. Then there is the more startling end of this spectrum, the people who report that they experience essentially no inner speech at all, a condition that researchers have taken to calling anendophasia, meaning, roughly, an absence of the endophasic, the inwardly spoken. Russell Hurlburt, the psychologist whose descriptive experience sampling method involves paging people at random moments throughout their day and asking them to freeze and report exactly what was passing through their mind the instant before the beep, found across decades of this work that some people, when sampled honestly and repeatedly, essentially never catch themselves in inner speech. Not rarely, not occasionally, but close to never, no matter how many times they are interrupted and asked. And yet these are people who function perfectly well, who plan their days, solve problems, feel emotions, hold conversations, and by every outward measure, think just as capably as anyone else. It simply doesn't sound like anything to them while it happens. Some report a kind of wordless, imageless sense of a thought simply being present, fully formed, the way you might suddenly know you're hungry without narrating the fact to yourself first. It's worth sitting with how strange this is if you yourself have a chatty inner narrator, because it means the running commentary you may take as simply what thinking is in fact one particular style of thinking, vivid and natural to you, but not universal, not necessary, and not obviously superior. A related and equally illuminating case is aphantasia, a term coined by the neurologist Adam Zeman in 2015, describing people who, when asked to close their eyes and picture a familiar face, or a beach, or an apple, report seeing nothing at all. No mental image forms. They can still describe an apple perfectly well, its shape, its color, the way it feels in the hand, because that knowledge is stored and retrievable in some form, but the retrieval doesn't come dressed as a picture. Interestingly, aphantasia and anendophasia appear to be at least partly separate conditions. Someone can lack mental imagery while still having a rich inner voice, or lack an inner voice while still picturing things vividly, or, more rarely, lack both. Which suggests that whatever machinery in the brain constructs sensory-feeling inner experience is not one single system, but something more like several overlapping systems, each of which can apparently be dialed down or absent in a given person without the rest of the mind being any less capable. None of this is evenly distributed across languages and cultures, either. Bilingual and multilingual speakers offer their own quiet puzzle, because many report that their inner voice switches, sometimes deliberately and sometimes without their noticing, depending on which language fits the thought, who they were just speaking with, or even what kind of thought it is. Some people finding that arithmetic runs more naturally in the language of their early schooling, no matter how fluent they later became in another tongue, decades on. Different languages hand their speakers different vocabularies for talking about the very phenomenon we've been discussing all this time.
English speakers reach for the single word, voice, to cover a startling range of experiences, from a passing internal comment to a full auditory hallucination, and that linguistic lumping may itself shape how comfortable people feel describing what's happening to them, and how doctors and researchers end up categorizing it. Anthropologists working across different cultures, including the researcher Tanya Luhrmann, in her comparative studies of how people in the United States, Ghana, and India describe hearing voices, have found real differences in how those experiences are framed and felt. Some cultures describing voices as intrusive and unwelcome, others describing them, even in cases involving real distress, as more like the presence of ancestors or spirits, a framing that appears to change not just how frightening the experience is reported to be, but, remarkably, some of its actual texture. And if human minds vary this much among themselves, it's worth pausing, gently, on the humility required when we ask whether any of this happens in other animals at all. A dog cannot tell us whether it experiences anything like inner narration, and neither can a crow or an octopus, however cleverly each of them solves the problems put in front of it. Behavior alone, however impressive, cannot settle the question of what, if anything, it is like to be that creature from the inside, and researchers who study animal cognition have learned to be quite careful about the gap between what an animal does and what an animal privately experiences while doing it. Which is, in its own way, a fitting note to end on for a moment, because it turns out the very same caution applies closer to home than you might expect.
It applies especially close to home, in fact, because the caution that keeps a careful researcher from claiming too much about a crow's inner life is the same caution worth extending to your own account of your own mind. You have been listening to your inner voice for as long as you have had one, and yet, as we've spent this whole long night discovering, it remains oddly unclear, even to you, what that voice actually is, where exactly it happens, or whether the version of it you notice bears much resemblance to the version that's actually running underneath, most of the time unnoticed. This isn't a failure of attention, it's closer to a structural feature of the whole arrangement. The instrument you would use to examine your own thinking is made of the same stuff as the thinking itself, which is a little like trying to see your own eyes without a mirror, or trying to bite your own teeth. Some part of the system can be turned toward another part, briefly, but the whole never quite folds back to look at all of itself at once. So a few honest loose ends remain, and there's no need to tie them up tonight, or ever, really, because some of them may not be the kind of question that gets a tidy answer, only better and better ways of asking it. One of the strangest is the question of why some thoughts arrive dressed in words at all, while others don't bother with language and arrive some other way instead, as a felt shape, a spatial hunch, a wordless certainty that you'll take the second exit rather than the first, one you couldn't easily explain if someone asked you to justify it out loud. Both kinds of thinking get things done. Both kinds solve real problems, plan real actions, notice real patterns, and yet only one of them shows up wearing sentences. Researchers who've studied this, including the psychologist Russell Hurlburt, with his decades of work sampling people's inner experience at random, unannounced moments throughout the day, have found that verbal inner speech turns out to occupy a smaller fraction of ordinary mental life than most people assume before they start paying close attention, with large chunks of thought instead taking the form of unsymbolized thinking, wordless and imageless, but every bit as directed, or sensory imagery, or brief flickers of feeling,
that never get named. Nobody has a settled account of what tips a given piece of mental work toward language and what leaves it wordless. It may have to do with how much the thought benefits from being sequenced, held in a fixed order, turned over, and reconsidered the way a sentence can be. It may have to do with habit, with which pathways get worn smooth by years of narrating your own life to yourself. Most likely, it's some tangle of both, plus factors nobody has isolated yet. And there is the deeper question, sitting underneath all of that, the one about who is doing the talking and who is doing the listening, when in the end, there is only one brain involved. It's tempting to imagine two little occupants in there, a speaker and a hearer, passing sentences back and forth like two people in a small room, but the evidence doesn't really support two occupants of any kind. It supports one very large, very distributed system, generating a stream of words in something like the same regions it would use to speak them aloud, and simultaneously registering that stream in something like the same regions it would use to hear them from outside. The sense of a conversation is real, as a felt experience. The two conversation partners, less so. What you're left with is closer to an echo that somehow produces its own sound, or a river that is also, somehow, its own bank. Language works this way structurally too, if you think about it, because a sentence needs both a speaker's intention and a listener's uptake to mean anything at all, and your brain, being a single organ, has learned to supply both halves of that transaction internally, quietly, without needing another person in the room. That doesn't make the voice fake, or make you strange for experiencing it as a kind of company. It only means the company is closer to a very convincing performance than to a second guest at the table, and most performances, however convincing, are still worth enjoying for what they give you, rather than worth dismissing for what they aren't. None of this, incidentally, needs solving before you can rest. People slept soundly for all of recorded history, without knowing that language mostly lives in networks, distributed across both hemispheres, rather than tucked into two tidy 19th century boxes, without knowing that the inner voice recruits the motor cortex the same way actual speech does, without knowing any of the dozen half-answers we've turned over together tonight. The mystery was fully present the entire time, running quietly under every good night's sleep anyone has ever had, and it will keep running under yours, unbothered by whether you've resolved it. There is something almost restful in that thought itself, if you let it settle. You don't have to finish understanding your own mind before your own mind is allowed to rest. The two were never actually linked. So let the questions go loose now, however unfinished they are. Let the whole evening's worth of half-explanations, the split brains and the phantom conversations, and the private languages of childhood drift apart the way conversation drifts apart at the end of a long, easy evening with old friends, nobody rushing to conclude anything, sentences trailing off mid-thought because everyone already knows roughly what the other meant, and finishing the thought out loud would only be extra effort nobody needs to spend. That's roughly where your own inner voice can rest tonight too, not concluded, not silenced, just loosened. Notice, if there's any noticing left in you at all, how quiet the space around you has become. Somewhere back at the start of all this, words were doing quite a lot of work, holding your attention, walking you from one idea to the next, building small, sturdy bridges out of sentences so your mind would have something to step across. Most of that scaffolding has already served its purpose and can be let down now. If there are still a few words drifting through you, let them be soft ones, short ones, the kind that don't ask anything of you, heavy, warm, held. You don't need to answer them. You don't even need to finish hearing them. A phrase can begin and simply fade before it ends, The way a sentence murmured by someone falling asleep beside you trails off into breathing instead of a period, and nobody minds, and nothing is lost by the trailing. Let your inner voice, if it's still there at all, get slower than it's been all night. Let the gaps between its words widen, the way footsteps widen, and slow, when someone is walking toward a bed they already know is warm. There's no next thought that needs finding right now, no sentence that needs completing. If a word arrives, let it arrive alone, without needing another to follow it. Drifting, settling, quiet, and underneath even that, underneath the last few loosely drifting words, there is simply you, the one who is listening to all of this the whole time, the same one who will still be here in the morning, whether or not a single sentence gets spoken between now and then. You don't need the voice to prove you're there. You were always the one it was speaking to, and the one, quietly, it was speaking from. Both at once, no contradiction, the way a room can hold its own echo without anyone finding that strange. Let it all go quiet now. Let the last words dissolve the way breath dissolves into the dark. No trace, no effort, nothing left to hold, just the slow rise and fall of your own breathing, softer now, carrying you the rest of the way, needing no words at all. Rest well.